So we're absorbing all of this carbs. Right? And depending upon what you eat, dictates how much glucose you're consuming at one time. The body likes a certain range to which normal blood glucose resides within. And so it's always working to maintain that level. And I think I have that on the next slide. It's like 70 to 100. I think this book calls it 70 to 99 milligrams per deciliter of blood. Let me just, for grins and giggles, yeah, right there. Okay, milligrams per deciliter. That's the range that we like to keep blood within, glucose within the blood within, right? To maintain that, we have two major hormones, all right? There's a few other hormones involved there, and if you're curious, we discuss a little bit more in phys, so come to physiology class, all right? But these are the two major hormones in which we regulate our blood glucose levels. Please know them, okay? Please know them, all right? Because diabetes is a pretty serious condition, very common condition anymore, it seems like. Understanding the differences between them, knowing these two hormones, because they are going to be intimately involved in the development of diabetes potentially. So these are your two hormones, insulin and glucagon. You can see they are specific cells, okay? There's alpha cells, there's beta cells within the pancreas, there's delta cells, there's F cells within the pancreas, and all of them secrete something specific. For the ones that I want you to know, insulin and glucagon, insulin is secreted by beta cells of the pancreas. Glucagon is secreted by the alpha cells. Why is that significant? Because with diabetes, we get a burnout of beta cells, or you're not born with the requisite amount of beta cells, okay? Depending on the type of diabetes you have. So it's beta cells, beta cells, beta cells, beta cells, right? Those are going to be the dudes that are involved with this process. Insulin helps to lower blood glucose levels. So after you eat, you absorb all those glucose molecules, all those monosaccharides within the blood. They start to flood within there. Insulin gets secreted. Insulin helps to facilitate the movement of glucose from the blood into the cell. Helps us to fund it, make ATP, produce energy, so the cell can do what it do. Glucagon is what the pancreas secretes a few hours after eating. A few hours after eating, glucose levels start to drop back down. As soon as they go below 70, as soon as they go below that 70 number there, glucagon will get secreted by the alpha cells. This acts on the stores of glycogen. Causes glycogen to be clipped off. Glucose molecule enters into the blood, and now we get a rise in blood glucose levels. After you've burned through all your stores, then you're going to start utilizing fats. Okay. And I don't want to confuse, okay? These are the two major things. So you eat, glucose levels rise, insulin gets secreted to help lower that blood glucose levels, get it back down below 199. Glucagon, after a couple hours and blood glucose levels start to drop, glucagon gets secreted, it acts on the glycogen, cuts off glucose molecules from it, gets back into the blood, and blood glucose levels start to rise again. I think I have a picture of that. There, you can kind of see it right here. Okay? And that's not even a very good picture. See, when blood glucose levels start to drop, it gets around 70. You can see pancreas secretes glucagon and it starts to rise back up. And it's not, as you can kind of see, not boom all of a sudden, but it's a nice, fantastic, gradual kind of rise. All right. So let's go back here. All right. This is a number that I would like you to know. Okay. These are numbers that I would like you to know. 70 to 99 milligrams per deciliter. How does insulin get it into the cell? It actually facilitates the cells to insert a transport protein into the surface of the cell, which then absorbs glucose. Okay, it's not like insulin goes and grabs its hand and says, "Come on over here, young person. I'm going to take you into the cell." It doesn't do that. All right. Insulin binds to the cell, to a specific receptor on the cell, and then that cell will then insert a receptor into its surface to pull in a glucose molecule. That's how it happens. And I think I already talked about all this nonsense right there. So again, like I said, after a few hours, glucagon gets secreted and breaks down glycogen. That's what that word is right there. There's glycogen. Okay, that's the storage form of glucose. Storage of glucose. And lysis means to break, to destroy. Okay. This is how glucagon works. Okay, it goes in, it's an enzyme, and it just goes and cleaves off some of the bonds in between those glycosidic bonds that exist in between those glucose molecules. All right, glucose enters back into the blood, and cells can have the funds in which to make energy. This is the number one thing that glucagon does, is promote this glycogenolysis, this breakdown of glycogen. It also will stimulate the liver to produce glucose from amino acids. Also the kidneys. The liver is the primary place, but the liver and the kidneys both do it. Okay? So not only does glucagon stimulate the breakdown of glycogen, but what happens if you don't have your stores of glycogen? Okay, let's say you've exhausted your stores of glycogen, okay, because of exercise or because you just don't eat carbs for some crazy reason. Okay? So if you don't have an excessive amount of stores, a sufficient amount of stores, what in the heck is your body going to do? Well, we have amino acids that are glycogenic. Okay, we have amino acids that are glycogenic or glucogenic. Sorry, that's the specific word. Okay, what does that mean? It means that those specific amino acids can become a glucose molecule. How does that happen? Magic. The body will secrete glucagon, no stores of glycogen. So the next thing it goes to is to break down structure. Protein. Amino acids are proteins. Okay. So it breaks down those amino acids, which destroy structure. And we do this in a couple, major locations there, the liver, the kidneys. We convert those amino acids through a pretty complex process, and we'll talk about that in metabolism as we're simplified. And we'll talk about that when we talk about that in chapter 8, metabolism. Okay. So this is the second thing it does. The third thing that glucagon does, 3, is stimulate lipolysis. And it's the same thing. Lysis to destroy, and obviously this is now fat. Okay. Specifically, the fat that we're going to be talking about is triglyceride. This is the primary lipid in our diets. Okay. We'll talk about that when we get into the next chapter. This helps to break fats, triglycerides, down into glycerol and fatty acids. These now enter into the bloodstream, and now these can be made into energy. How? We'll talk about that in the next chapter. So glucagon does 3 major things. Promotes glycogenolysis, which everybody equates with it. But it's number 2 and number 3 that people forget about on an exam. If that's not a hint, I don't know what to tell you. There's your glucose molecule. We need oxygen to effectively make a lot of energy from glucose. Again, we'll talk about that in metabolism. It's not a whole hell of a lot of energy, but when there's a lot of these glucose molecules and sufficient amount of oxygen, we can make a nice amount of energy. We also release carbon dioxide. We also form carbon dioxide and water, which we get rid of. Cells pick up. This is waste, right? You exhale in the lungs and the kidneys absorb that and get rid of it. So waste products are also produced as well. But this is going to be the major thing. This is what we're going to be talking about in chapter 8 when we look at metabolism. Here's a number right here. Here's the recommended RDA for carbohydrate consumption today. About 130 grams per day is what is the recommended amount, recommended dietary allowance. Why is glucose, why is carbohydrates really important? Why is it important to get carbohydrates in your diet? Because of this first thing right here. Okay. You need some carbohydrates to facilitate the action of Krebs cycle. We'll talk about this in chapter 8. Okay. But if you want to put Krebs cycle, chapter 8 here in the side of fat right there, so you can remember to, when you're looking at chapter 8, come back here to slide, what slide is this? Slide 53. Okay. Glucose for energy. This is what's going to connect these two chapters. We need to make intermediates in Krebs cycle. Okay. Krebs cycle is a way that we can make a good chunk of energy from. Again, we'll talk about that in chapter 8. If we don't get enough glucose, I don't make the intermediates. And if my body is not having glycogen stores, not having carbohydrates, then it's going to go to fat. And if I don't have enough glucose in there to make those intermediates, the body's ability to utilize fat effectively becomes hindered. We get what's called ketone bodies forming, and we'll talk about where ketone bodies come from in the next chapter. All right, but it's, as you can kind of see there, it's an incomplete breakdown of fat. The body can use some of those ketones. Okay, some of them we can't. Right? If too many of these ketone bodies accumulate within the blood, it can result in what's called ketosis. Okay. Ketosis can change the pH balance of blood, which would affect the functionality of your organ systems. Kidneys can start to diminish in function, can shut down. And this will cascade into a number of other things. Brain, think of an organ, it'll be diminished in its function. If you're somebody who's a diabetic, holy smokes, then death is usually what that can lead to if you can't control your sugar balances within your blood. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next chapter, and then we'll talk about it as well in chapter 8.